Hello everyone, welcome to AdQ&A episode 11. I'm Nick Sinitra, and today we are talking about testing methodology. Specifically, we're going to talk about when to test, what to test, and how to test. So let's start with the when, right? And first, let me just give a disclaimer that all of these techniques will apply to pretty much any media channel you care to run on, whether that's Google Ads, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Pinterest, you name it. We're going to be talking about methodologies that should transcend and be portable between all of these different channels. Okay, so that out of the way, let's talk about the when. Short answer, always, right? Always be testing. Like I said in the other episode, tattooed across my chest, that's totally a thing. So the question is not so much about when to test, it's more about the what and the how. So we'll get into that in a second. Just the one thing I will touch back on in terms of the when is that you have to think about really maximizing the area under the curve, right? When you think about seasonality, consider the fact that if you are selling, let's say, bathing suits or outdoor furniture or whatever the case may be, rationally those things are going to have a peak season that's in the summer versus a different type of product like snowshoes that's in the winter. So if you are trying to maximize the area under the curve, that is to say, when you know the traffic is going to spike, you don't want to start your tests at a time when the volume is high, right? The goal really with testing is to raise the bar, but to do so in a way that minimizes the opportunity cost of testing, right? And allows you to find results quickly and effectively at a low cost. So if you are trying to test new creatives, if you're trying to test new audiences and things like that, you really want to be aware of the ebb and flow of traffic from your different traffic sources so that you're not incurring inordinately high opportunity cost for testing during the peak, right? Find your wins where applicable. Obviously, you can't test 4th of July creative in May, but if it's a type of product and it can make sense to test at a different time, you can start doing those tests and feeling it out so that you can hit it hard when those peaks come. We're going to have another episode that's all about this kind of thing specifically for Black Friday, Cyber Monday. When should you start? What kinds of things should you test? How do you kind of gear yourself up for success? But that's just a high level view of the when. Now we can really get into the meat of it, which is the what and the how. So as far as the what, right, a big part of this is identifying where the holes in the bucket are, right? Whether you focus on creatives or audiences or landing pages or whatever the case may be, really should be dictated by where is the maximum opportunity, right? So if you're looking at your performance and you're seeing high conversion rate. So let's say your conversion rate is like 4 or 5%. For ecom, that's pretty good, right? We think about sort of 2% being kind of the floor. And if we're below 2%, we've got problems. So let's say that your conversion rate is 4 or 5%. And your CPAs are, reasonable, or your conversion rate is reasonable, but the problem seems to be that for whatever reason, over time, your click-through rate has come down, right? So, this part isn't rocket science. If your click-through rate is coming down, really creatives are what is going to have the biggest impact on affecting click-through rate. So, all things being equal, if you can get a lower cost per click and nothing else changes down the purchase funnel, then your cost per conversion should come down as well, right? So no rocket science there. So for that type of scenario, you would want to focus on creatives, right? Now, keep in mind too that creatives can have an impact on further downstream events as well, right? So for instance, if your creative all of a sudden incorporates a new offer, right, or promo or discount code, not only may that contribute to more positive engagement at the top of the funnel, but now that people have an added incentive to purchase, it could also influence conversion rates. You also need to think about things like, is your creative setting an expectation which your landing page then has to fulfill, right? And if you're saying something in your creative that's really compelling, but then there's nothing on your landing page to back that up, that can be an issue as well. So in an ideal world, you want all of these things to align, but really the point is just to say that you want to try to identify in that funnel where the biggest holes are in that bucket so that you can address those directly, right? So that's part of the what. The second thing that you need to do is think also in terms of the bigger picture, right? So for this, I love metaphors. We're going to give you another one. So say you're a farmer, right? And no matter what you do, you can't get the seeds to grow. You've tried planting them over here. You've tried planting them over there. You've tried planting them right at your feet. You've tried different farming implements. You've tried different tilling techniques, and the seeds just won't grow, right? So what are you supposed to conclude from that? What if you zoom out and realize, oh, you were trying to plant seeds in sand the whole time, right? So where am I going with this? there can be times where there's a bigger problem, right, that is too big to just be addressed directly through creative, or through audiences and so forth. And so in this case, the SAN might represent your website, right? If you look at Google Analytics and you notice that no matter what the traffic source is, whether it's organic or paid or whatever it is, people are getting to your website, they're bouncing immediately, right? So you've got a high bounce rate, you've got low time on page, the number of pages per session is really small. That's telling you that you're either setting the wrong expectation with the creatives and then people are getting there and their expectations are being subverted, or there's just something else wrong with your site. There's something repellent that is causing people to flee. Maybe they're seeing the price and it's way more than they thought, It could be one of a number of different factors. Or maybe the load speed is really long, right? To where users now that are on mobile, right, make up the vast majority of users of Facebook, for instance, right? Most people who are using Facebook on a day-to-day basis are doing so via their mobile device. So they see a Facebook ad, they get to the website. If the website's not optimized for mobile and it takes 8 seconds to load the page, people may be bouncing before they even load a single image or word on the page. So that's what I mean about understand the big picture, right? Don't get myopically focused on addressing one specific thing when there may be deeper underlying issues that you need to address, right? So that's another piece. So the what now, right? We pretty much nailed that down. So again, think about where the holes in the bucket are, and if the answer is that everything is messed up, then really you can't go wrong. Really, whatever you choose to focus on, whether it's an audience or a creative or a landing page, right? Any one of those would be a good place to start potentially. Now, as far as the how, this is really going to be kind of the meat and potatoes of this episode, because the reality is that if you test the wrong way, it can be extremely costly, right? Our whole testing philosophy is based around getting from point A to point B in the least amount of time, get reasonable stat sig and minimize that cost of testing, right? And testing with an appropriate and responsible budget so that we're not, basically throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? So let's kind of talk through some of these things. One of the first things I want to talk about is a concept of confounding variables. So if nobody's ever mentioned this before, you haven't heard of this idea, confounding variables are basically things that can muddy the water when it comes to deriving an actionable insight from a given test, right? So it'll make more sense when I show you the spreadsheet in a second, but basically, yeah, let's actually just jump into it. So bear with me just a moment. I'm going to make a couple of quick tweaks here. First, we are going to pull up the window capture, and then we're going to get rid of these things. And we're going to get the webcam on there. Boom, there we go. That ought to do it. Okay, so let me pull up this page. All right, here's an example of a bad way to do a test. So here we basically have what is the variation. So we've got, let's say, a control ad, which is the A in the A/B test, and then we've got the test ad, which is the B in an A/B test. So the control variation is using video15.mp4, whatever that is, doesn't really matter. Okay, and then the copy says for a limited time, save 20% on all widgets, pretty straightforward. And then here's the destination URL, widgetworld.com/sale. The control variation by comparison, or sorry, the test variation by comparison is using an image instead of a video. It has the same text, and it's going to a different page. Here's what I mean by confounding variables. If we run this test and the test variation B performs better, what are you supposed to conclude from that? How do you know whether it's the image that made the difference, right, versus the video, or the destination URL which made the difference? You don't, right? But that is what it means to be a confounding variable, is that you've essentially introduced ambiguity into the test by changing more than one variable at once. So the correct way that you should run a test, whether it's an image test or an audience test or a copy test or whatever it is to change one thing, right? So that any difference in performance between A and B can be attributed to that one thing that changed between them. So here is an example of the right way to do this. Here you've got the same exact video, video 15, you've got the same exact copy, and then you've got a different destination URL. So this basically is a landing page test. Here the idea being that I'm going to use the same exact video, I'm going to use the same exact copy, but instead of just dropping somebody on a sale page that might have multiple different products, all of which are on sale, maybe I want to try dropping people just onto one product that's my top seller and see if that improves conversion rates. So simple test, and it's done in a logical way. This is a rigorous, well-structured test, right? And if this one performs better or worse, I will know that it's that one specific piece that was responsible for that change. So, again, this idea of actionable insights, right? An insight that's not actionable really has no value, right? Again, like going back to that farming situation, I don't really have any takeaway there. I've tried all this different, all these different things, but because I didn't approach my test in a logical way, well, there's a bigger underlying issue there. But I just tried a whole bunch of things, and I tried seed A with tool X, and I tried seed B with tool Z, and all this stuff, and I didn't really approach it in a logical way, right? So the other piece about how to test is, which really is also part of what to test, is focusing on the vital factors, right? So a good kind of test case for this would be in Google search, right? Generally speaking, you're going to have, think about the Pareto principle. You're going to have a handful of keywords that are going to make up the vast majority of your volume, right? So 20% of your keywords make up 80% of the volume, and then you've got this sort of long tail of keywords. So does it make sense to do, ad copy tests, let's say, for some of the ad groups that include your low volume keywords? I mean, yeah, you could do it, and it would make sense to do it on, at some point in time. But if you're having to split your test budget, right, if you only have so much budget that you can allocate towards testing, then you really want to focus that budget on the area that's going to make the greatest impact, right? So focus on the vital factors, kind of the ruthless priorities. That, testing, doing an ad copy test on a long tail keyword is not going to have as great of an impact as testing on one of your head keywords. Of course, at the same time, it also bears a greater opportunity cost, which is why it's important, where possible, to use those leading indicators like we talked about in one of the past episodes. If you have enough data to where you don't need to optimize as far down the funnel or test as far down the funnel, then you can basically test using less data and make decisions faster and cheaper, right? So budget. So I've got some calculators, and I'll probably share these in an upcoming episode, but here's kind of the way generally that we think about what is the appropriate test budget, right? All of our partners have a certain return on ad spend or a certain CPA that they need to hit no matter what, right? Call that the floor, right? And the way that we kind of think about testing budget is, what is the most that we can spend at a reduced ROAS, right? Without basically tanking the aggregate performance for the account below that floor, right? So it's basically an algebra problem, but essentially, if your total budget is 30K, maybe and you can't go below 200% ROAS, maybe you can only afford to spend 5K on a test at a 50% ROAS without basically nuking the overall. And again, maybe in one of the links or in a future episode, we can walk through some of these things in greater detail. So let me actually change back here. So we'll go back to the larger webcam here, like that. Turn that one off. Okay, cool. So yeah, basically that's a way to think about it, is how much can you afford to test with, right? That's basically the question. How much can you afford to spend on testing, right? And do you maximize that budget? And what is the appropriate amount of budget that you can spend on a given test? Well, I think we talked about in this past episode, I'm probably going to say that a lot, but depending on the platform that you're testing on, there's going to be a different kind of recommended best practice for what is the bare minimum amount of budget that you need for a given test. But generally, the way that we would think about this as a rule of thumb is, whatever your current CPA is, your current cost per conversion, you generally want to have a daily budget that's anywhere between 3 and 5 times that, right? And of course, again, with the exception of cases where your cost per conversion is in the thousands, right? And you have already plenty of leading indicators that you can use to optimize to a cost per lead or what have you. Then you can have a smaller budget. You can do 3 to 5 times the cost per lead, not necessarily 3 to 5 times the cost per purchase. And then keep in mind too that if you're doing a test between different creatives, your new ad set that you introduce, ad set or ad group, whatever the case may be, the budget may be getting split within there between different ads as well, right? Or keywords or whatever the case may be. So you do need to kind of take that into consideration as well. So how much data, right? What do we sort of consider statistically significant? There are plenty of statistical significance calculators out there. Whether you want to just use simple formula or you want to go crazy with chi-square formulas and all that kind of thing. But basically it's really this sort of iron triangle if you want to think about it in terms of good, fast, and cheap, right? In the context of testing, I think about good, right? Good is basically stat sig, right? And the fast and cheap are basically, it is what it is. So if you want to run a test fast, right, and good, right, it's not cheap, right, because you basically have to spend a lot of money to learn fast. If you want to run a test cheaply and you want to get high statistical significance, then it's not necessarily going to be fast, right? So that's basically the kind of the idea there. But in terms of the number, I mean, let's generally, again, as a rule of thumb, we're looking for, maybe 10, 15, 20 conversions before we start to say, unequivocally, hey, this is going to be really good or really bad. And there's always going to be exceptions. There might be times where you start running a test and you see, okay, well, I've only got a handful of conversions, so I don't really feel like it's statistically significant from a conversion perspective, but you might be looking at the top of the funnel metrics and seeing that relative to the control, my CPC is like 3, 4, 5 times higher. My CPM is dramatically higher. My click-through rate is dramatically lower. Even if it converted at the same rate as my control, that those changes in top of funnel metrics would mean that it wouldn't back out where I want it to. So this is why it's hard to kind of just give a simple answer as to what's the right amount of data. You have to sort of use your judgment, but try to basically shoehorn it into as little data as you can, but still give it a chance. So yeah, we talked about the good, fast, cheap, and then we talked about leading indicators, right? So again, the principle there, and I would encourage you to go back and watch that earlier one, is that if you know, based on historical data, that regardless of the audience, regardless of the creative, regardless of the landing page, that you tend to have an add to cart turn into a purchase at a particular rate pretty consistently, with minor variations over time, then that will basically tell you, okay, now, given a known quantity of add to carts, I can basically do some projections and see, okay, well, based on what I'm paying for the add to cart, I know that if it's going to convert at a 10%, then my cost per purchase is going to be X, right? So then you can get 10, 15, 20 add to carts instead of 10 to 15, 20 purchases, and basically make that decision with less data. Cool, so we're a little bit over the usual amount of time. I know that was kind of a lightning round. I would love to know if people have questions about any of those things that we talked about. Hit us up in the comments. Let us know if there's anything that you want us to dive deeper on, specifically around the when and the what and the how. Would love to expand on that. So thanks for watching. I'm Nick Sinitra. This is adQ&A Live, and we'll see you next time.